whoever you are, powerlessly parochial, or a facultative Faustian. Hello. On the day that Ted Bundy was executed, crowds gathered all over America, singing and cheering, united in their hatred of perhaps the world's most infamous serial killer. Their righteous indignation was predicated on the belief that Ted Bundy had a choice to do all the terrible things that he did. Obviously, Bundy's crimes were extreme and unjust, but had a disease killed all those young women, the result would have been no less profoundly sad, except without the anger. Nobody gets angry at a disease, or a deadly natural disaster, or when a beloved relative dies of old age. Somehow, the deliberate decision to take someone's life is different. Many feel that the public's bloodlust and thirst for vengeance is a natural reaction to such appalling crimes, as if what's natural equates to what's right, and what motivates a murderer must be unnatural somehow. These issues need to be hashed out if we're to maintain a consistent and reasonable worldview, one that is up to date with current thinking around human volition or free will. So, voluntarily or obligately, let's dive into the issue of free will and work out whether such freedom is likely or even possible. Experience tells me that the best place to dive in is the deep end, so here goes. It seems to me that there are only two reasons for people to do anything. Right or wrong, good or evil, beneficial or not. Every choice that we make can either come about because it's something that we want to do or something we're forced to do. That's it. Without exception, beneath layers of social complexity, there can be no other impetus for our human behaviours. Now, clearly, if someone is being forced to do something, they are not acting of their own free will. The things a person might be forced to do if they or their loved ones were being threatened bears little resemblance to their natural moral character. But does a lack of coercion imply complete responsibility? What other situations can you think of where someone might act without, or even against, their own free will? People gripped with phobic avoidance often feel physically paralysed, unable to act the way that their rational minds want them to. Phobias show us how a person's behaviour can be forced by an underlying psychology rather than another person. There are many instances when a person's emotions override their rational minds. Individuals consumed with rage, love, or grief often behave as if they're on autopilot. The victims of such afflictions will frequently contribute to their own harm and are often utterly beyond reasoning with. But phobic and highly emotional mind hijacking are not the only instances when our free will gets diminished. Severe brain injuries can often leave people acting out of character, strongly suggesting that our personalities have some physical component. Illness, addiction, and intoxication affect human decision-making on a daily basis. Is free will reserved only for the sober and the healthy? What about the effects of long-term incarceration, brainwashing, social pressures, distraction, and standard-issue cognitive biases? In episode 31, we even considered that the microbes living within our bodies might contribute to our various wants, likes, and personalities. Whatever free means in the context of willpower, it doesn't seem to be on very stable ground. Spared all of those uncontrollable forces that influence our decisions, surely wants are what truly define us. It's what we want that determines what we do, and our free will is what takes us there. This sounds vaguely plausible, but perhaps a better definition of free will is what we need. It is a slippery concept, as we've seen. Having put the question to a few friends of mine in advance of this episode, one recurring idea was that free will involves choosing between different courses of action unimpeded. I do love semantic discussions like this because they urge us to confront what we think we know. To me, this definition isn't particularly watertight, as it would mean that physical constraints, like imprisonment and gravity, can deprive people of their free will. Does my inability to breathe underwater, despite wishing I could, count against my free will? I don't think it should. So maybe choosing between different courses of action unimpeded is a better description of freedom in general. A more robust definition might simply be the ability to have acted differently. Winding back the clock and pressing play again means that it would have been completely possible for you to have done something else. As we'll see, it's doubtful that this version of free will can even possibly exist. For my money, to have acted differently in any situation, a person must be consciously aware of every factor impacting on that decision. But more than this, not only must every subtle influence be noticed, but also controlled. To drive this home, consider what kinds of factors affect the choices that you make. How about your basic biological needs, like how hungry you are, or how much sleep you've had, whether you're uncomfortably hot, cold, or operating in a highly stressful environment? Psychological testing shows that all of these contributions make our decisions more emotional, reflexive, and conservative. If people did truly possess utterly free will, they would need to be aware of all of these effects and be able to correct for them, maintaining flawless decisional consistency at all times. This is plainly not the case, so our choices, our decisions, our will cannot be truly free. This introduces another fascinating idea, one that cosmic mastermind Stephen Hawking first brought to my attention in one of his books. If you were to come face to face with a mysterious, unknown species of animal, an alien from another planet, or a robot, how could you tell if it had free will? The actions of a mechanical creation like a robot would be completely determined by its programming, and therefore, in essence, completely predictable. In practice, of course, our ability to anticipate any outcome grows weaker as a system gets more complicated. This is how chess computers are able to beat human grand masters, though few would argue that Deep Blue or AlphaZero possess free will. We generally accept that machines are governed by the laws of physics, yet human minds can't fathom the equations governing 3 or more interacting particles with any real precision. When it comes to a living animal or a person-sized alien composed of over 1 trillion molecular components, it's understandably ambitious to predict exactly what it will do. It seems we have no choice but to attribute free will to such a being, though this may just be, quote, an admission of our inability to do the calculations that would enable us to predict its actions, end quote. That's how Stephen put it. And if you ask me, this seems like another reasonable working definition of free will. Before he passed away last year, philosopher of the mind Daniel Dennett chucked us some equally delicious thought food. How can we tell if an animal or alien is even alive? Simply observing that it has purposeful movements and animated limbs doesn't rule out that it might be a very sophisticated robot. The lines between living and non-living, conscious and non-conscious, free and determined are conceptually blurry, and unleash some pretty imaginative speculation. Are atoms alive? Do proteins have free will? Are individual cells conscious? As these questions bear very little relevance to science, scientists rarely ask. It's enough to note that as atoms combine to create proteins, and proteins combined to form cells, increasing complexity gradually creates things that are manifestly alive, conscious, and in possession of distinct goals. If atoms and molecules are obedient only to the laws of physics, which they must be, any impression of free will that gradually emerges must ultimately be determined by the laws of physics too. There are very few laws that govern the universe. From quantum fields and subatomic particles to atoms and molecules, a hierarchy emerges. Each level can be described with its own set of rules and principles, none of which violate the fundamental laws at the bottom. From molecules to cells, brains, emotions, subjective experiences, and artistic inspiration, all of the complexity of life comes fizzing out. The most adaptive systems, like organisms, brains, ecosystems, and cultures, give rise to more emergent properties, as well as accidents and flukes of nature. This is how, from those few universal laws, we get a myriad of interacting components that collectively behave in unpredictable ways. It's that unpredictability that we call free will, according to Professor Hawking. But whether it's a true facet of our being, a limitation of our predictive power, or some immaterial essence that embodies us with free will, the laws of physics always and at every level must remain intact. We are, after all made of cells, governed by purely biological processes, including our brain cells. On their own, brain cells have no thoughts or emotions, yet a collection of brain cells gives rise to a mind that can direct the body in pursuit of internal desires. Here we need to consider the subconscious. In the year 2025, it shouldn't be too shocking to listeners to hear that most of what goes on in our brains lurks subconsciously. On top of this, most of the conscious choices that we make come from a limited set of options generated by the subconscious. This can be demonstrated quite trivially. Indulge me. Please think of an animal. Any animal at all. Got one in mind? Good. Now, there must be hundreds of items in the category animals that you could name and visualize. But I'm quite sure that you didn't stop to consider each of these hundreds of possibilities individually. If you are like every other human being ever, your subconscious probably gave you 2 or 3 options to choose from, and then you picked from one of those. Where did those few top-of-your-head animals come from? Why didn't you think of a goldfish? It's a legitimate choice, but I bet it never crossed your mind. We cannot be expected to choose things that don't occur to us. How can we? By offering us a small subset of options to choose between, our subconscious processes directly affect everything that we think, and therefore everything that we end up doing. Advertising works on this principle. If people were able to comprehend and control every subliminal influence prompting their decisions, advertising campaigns would be completely ineffective. Slogans, jingles, logos, and celebrity endorsements would have no impact on a population whose will was entirely their own. Instead, we find that humans are susceptible, impressionable, and tragically fallible beings, unaware of how open to suggestion they are. And don't think for a moment that I'm excluding myself in that scathing review. To be the author of my own thoughts, I'd have to think the thoughts before I thought them. In reality, even if I could trace the cacophony of life experiences that led to my subjective beliefs, my thoughts just seem to appear out of the void. See for yourself. Try, for just 60 seconds, to completely clear your mind of all thoughts. I promise you can't. Even if the fate of the world hung in the balance, it is practically impossible to willfully stop thinking. Some image or memory or idea will inevitably pop in there, if just to kick your free will while it's down. Anything that affects our behaviour, that is random or intrinsically unpredictable, can be lumped into the category things we're forced to do. Thoughts and actions that are underpinned by subconscious desires, emotions, physiological factors, or unconscious processes can't be chosen or controlled. Remember, it's my position that people only do things because they want to or because they're forced to. And the forced to category just swallowed practically everything. With so much of our lives at the mercy of chaos, claims that we possess anything like free will should fade away. But what about the things that we actually want? What if someone is fully aware of their preference for, staying in and playing video games over going to the gym? Completely hypothetical example. Surely they are in control of what they choose to do with a free afternoon. Well, not really. To see why, ask yourself, where does this hypothetical person's wants actually come from? Did they choose to like video games more than exercise? No. They just do as a fact of their existence. The same goes for what music we like and what we order from a menu. Our preference of clothing, comedy, and commodities seems to be something that we discover, not something that we decide. Recently, I discovered that I would rather pay money for a takeaway pizza than reheat some leftovers in the fridge. I didn't decide to want takeaway food, I just did. So the things that we want aren't things that we can choose or control either. When I think of something that I don't want, say I don't want to drop my laptop on my foot, I realise that there is no way that I can choose to want that thing instead. I might choose to do it in some bizarre circumstances, but I can't choose to want it. Because nobody is realistically able to gather a complete inventory of every factor, past and present, cultural and biological, that determines what they enjoy and what they loathe, our wants appear to arise spontaneously. People can't choose to enjoy eating healthy food, doing homework, or sustaining technological injuries. They just do or they don't, with absolutely no ability to change these preferences. On occasion, some enlightened soul may deliberately choose to eat a salad, knowing full well that they'd rather be gorging on a pizza. But phenomena like this are not hard to explain. It's a fact that some people do manage to eat healthily and drag themselves to the gym despite holding preferences to do otherwise. If we don't summon forth free will, then what's going on here? Put simply, exactly the same thing as before. In order to stay healthy, exercise, save money, or get out of bed in the morning, on some level we have to want those things. They may not be as enjoyable as alternatives, but all you need to do is possess sufficiently good reason to weigh one over the other. Conflict between vying options can be resolved with reason, though this doesn't need to be conscious. The weight that you assign to each variable, how good you consider certain reasons to be, which alternatives you've actually considered, and how enjoyable you find some activities versus others is all beyond your control. Genetics, stress, culture, upbringing, and brain chemistry all determine what we want and how much we want it. On any given day, I'll want to get up and go to work more than I want to get fired. I'll want to Netflix and chill more than I want washboard abs. And I'll want to hold the door open for people more than I want to see it close in their face. This is not free will, but sociobiological conditioning underpinned by neural processes. Did any of what I just said make any sense to you? If it did you choose that it made sense? Of course not. It just did, hopefully. A philosophical argument or an attempt to persuade you of something will either be successful or it won't. You can't decide to be persuaded of something or to what degree. Just like reading a sentence of text, it will either make grammatical sense or it won't. I don't know you, but at some point in your life you learnt how to speak English, and the sentences that you're hearing now make sense. You cannot consciously decide not to comprehend what I'm saying. You can't deliberately unlearn English. In the same way, those genes, environments, parents, and material fortunes we inherited from birth were not chosen by us. We did not pick our relatives, the date we were born, or the country and culture we were born into. We can't take credit for any of the advantages they bestowed. We do not make ourselves from scratch. Just like the languages that we eventually learn to comprehend, our subjective wants are as irresistibly prescribed as any other variable in a person's life. Despite this, an individual's beliefs, principles, and values, each tied to these uncontrollable factors, play a huge role in their actions. To paraphrase the neuroscientist Sam Harris, the recognition that you didn't make yourself, and that you are exactly as you are in this moment because the universe is exactly as it is in this moment, has a silver lining. You don't know how fully you can change from one moment to the next, either by good company or good conversation or listening to a good podcast. As components in such a dynamic system of influences, nobody is condemned to be who they were yesterday. This is why I want to record Wiggle Soup and open up these sorts of discussions. I didn't choose to want to do this, I just discovered that I do. Both good reasoning and good grammar require that a piece of software, either a synthetic computer or a biological organism, can follow the meaning of a statement and assess how well it conforms to a set of rules without glaring errors. This is the quality test that we use to determine whether a sentence is true or an argument is sound. You'll no doubt have noticed that your preference for a well-considered case over some airy-fairy flim-flam never required free will. It affects us automatically, the same way that an emotional response washes over us without prior consent. Any time we are given sufficiently good reason to believe something, we will, helplessly, be persuaded by it. Ultimately, you'll either be convinced of my point of view regarding free will, or you won't. The things we believe, like the things we want, are never actually a matter of choice. As humans, we can become convinced of things through compelling arguments that turn out not to be true. You'll always think you've been convinced for good reasons, because if you thought they were bad, you wouldn't be convinced. Still, the benefit of acting reasonably instead of emotionally is that reason is adjustable. It can accommodate new information. Assuming that I've communicated this idea clearly, a big assumption, you'll unavoidably factor my insights into your future thinking, making your convictions stronger or weaker as a result. Embracing the fact that free will may very likely be an illusion won't change how we live our lives, but it should change how we treat each other. For a start, it eliminates vengeance as a legitimate reason to punish someone. Dangerous criminals must still be removed from society to protect the public, to deter others in the future, and, in the case of imprisonment, to attempt rehabilitation. But deriving enjoyment from retribution, even for the most sickening of crimes, becomes gratuitous and sadistic. Hating people no longer makes any sense. Understanding how our bodies and brains operate equips us to deal with the behavior of others more effectively, and nods towards new strategies for bettering ourselves. Even without free will, compassion still inspires us to help others. Ambition still drives us towards goals. Boredom, cramp, envy, and full bladders still force us to get up and improve our lot in life. But the best lifestyle modifications only become available through accurate assessments of human nature. In every case, what deserves praise or blame is not the individual, it's the cascade of prior biographical events that sculpted them. It's the experiences, upbringing, and education that an individual happened to receive. It's the ideas and beliefs they unconsciously embrace that dictates how they see the world. It's interactions they've shared with others and the subjective meaning derived from those encounters. Each of us brings the universe into focus in our own unique, personal, and unforeseeable way. None of us freely will this, and the laws of nature never budge an inch. I feel like emotion got a bit of a raw deal there. Logic and reason are surely the cherry on our cognitive cake, but we shouldn't downplay how essential emotions are to our social lives. So next we'll take a quick tour of where emotions come from, what they've been so historically useful for, and when we should listen to their advice.